why wasn't this a good strategy in your mind? The toppling Ukrainian government, building it as a proxy against the Russians, to weaken one center of power so America could focus on China instead.
Well, my view, Glenn, is that the United States should only be concerned with containing potential regional hegemons. In other words, the reason I think the United States should focus on containing China is because China is very powerful and has the potential to dominate East Asia. I think this is not in America's interest. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers in the system. Russia is not a threat to dominate Europe. I believe Russia is not a threat to conquer all of Ukraine, much less conquer territory in Eastern Europe. The Russians have never manifested any interest in conquering Eastern Europe, much less dominating all of Europe. And furthermore, they don't have the capability to do that. That's the key. If you look at Russian capabilities, if you look at the size of the Russian population and you look at Russian wealth and you even look at the size of the Russian military, they're not a threat to be a hegemon in Europe. The Soviet Union was. In 1945, the Soviet Union was by far the most powerful European country. It was sitting in the middle of Germany. It had hundreds of divisions. The United States definitely had an interest in containing China, excuse me, in containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But Russia is not the Soviet Union. So the United States should not be pushing NATO eastward for the purpose of containing Russia. It should not be worrying any meaningful way about a Russian threat. And if there is any Russian threat, from an American point of view, it makes sense to let the Europeans contain that threat. But again, I don't even think there's a Russian threat to Europe. I don't think there's a threat that the Germans, the French, and the British have to worry about. Uh, so I have argued from the beginning it was a huge mistake to push NATO up to Russia's border. And it was a huge mistake to countenance bringing Ukraine into the alliance. And from a Russian perspective, I thought that this would be interpreted as an existential threat. And the Russians indeed have made it clear on numerous occasions that they view this as an existential threat. So the end result would be that you would get a war that would involve the United States that the United States shouldn't be involved in because Russia is not a threat to the United States. So this is why I argued that it was foolish in the extreme to push to bring Ukraine into NATO. But I think if you go over to East Asia, it's just a very different situation. I mean, you look at the size of the Chinese population, you look at how much wealth China has, and you look at where China is in terms of developing cutting edge technologies. The Chinese are going to give the Americans a real run for their money. I think there is some reasonable chance that in the future the Chinese will be in a position to dominate Asia. That's not the case now, and I don't think it's the case in the medium term, but who knows about the long term? The Chinese are a formidable rival to the United States, and I think the United States should be concerned about China and should be interested in containing China. This is not to argue, by the way, that the United States should look to fight a war against China. The United States should go to great lengths to avoid a war with China, for sure. But the United States, in my opinion, should contain China. But again, a different logic applies in my thinking when it comes to Russia.
Just my final question, just circle back to the Chinese issue. It would have been much easier, I guess, in the 90s or the 2000s to contain China. But what we see now with the economic rise of China, financially, technologically, it's not possible to prevent their further rise with containment. And in terms of military containment, the Chinese appear to be responding with, enhancing its military capabilities quite drastically, which has the industrial power to do so. So it is the last question. In what direction do you see the United States and China heading? Do you think there's some path towards some great power compromise in terms of some kind of a new balance that allows, enhance the security of both sides? Um, or do you think it's more likely to go towards a clash because it doesn't seem as if China wants accepts, for example, to live within the two island chains, which they spend a lot of time complaining about. So where does the U.S. and China go from here, you think?
Glenn, let me answer this question by going back to the early 1990s and say a few words about the US-China relationship throughout the 90s and the first 2 decades, or the first decade and a half of the 21st century. China was economically a very weak power, certainly relative to the United States in, let's say, 1990. And what the United States decided to do at that point in time was adopt a policy of engagement toward China. This was the unipolar moment, and liberal ideology dominated in the United States. We were not worried about realist logic. Realists were seen as dinosaurs at the time. So, what happens is the United States decides that it's going to adopt a policy of engagement with China, which is designed to make China powerful economically. In other words, we, the United States, fuel economic growth in China throughout the 90s and throughout the first at least 1.5 decades of the 21st century. And China, of course, grows more powerful. And when realists like me say this is not a smart thing to do because you're creating a peer competitor, uh, most policymakers and most pundits and most analysts in the United States argue that's wrong because what's going to happen is that as China gets more powerful economically and as it's integrated into institutions all around the world, these are American dominated institutions, as the Chinese are brought into those institutions, that China will become eventually a liberal democracy. It will be hooked on capitalism, and it will become a responsible stakeholder because it participates in all of these institutions. And the end result is that this powerful China will live happily ever after with the United States because they are both liberal democracies. And because they're both liberal democracies, we should expect a peaceful world. If you look at what the Chinese are saying at the time, they also have an ideological story to tell. This is the story that Jeff tells, Jeff Sachs, right? And that is that China is dominated by a Confucian ideology, right? And what the Chinese are emphasizing throughout the 1990s and again in the early 21st century is that they can rise peacefully because they have a Confucian culture. They don't believe in realpolitik. They don't believe in the ideas of John Mearsheimer any more than the Americans do. So you have these two countries, the United States and China, right, that are fueled by different ideologies that nevertheless both emphasize peaceful rise. The American liberal theory of international politics emphasizes peaceful rise, and Confucianism emphasizes peaceful rise. So, for many years, people think that as China grows more powerful, right, as it's integrated into institutions like the World Trade Organization, which really fuels its economic growth, that there's not going to be any problem. Now, my argument all along, and I was pretty much a lone voice in the wilderness, was this is not the way you want to think about this. Because as China gets more powerful, it's going to want to dominate East Asia. It's going to want to act like the United States. In other words, realist logic is going to kick in. But most people thought that I was living in the wrong century and that this is just not the way the world works. We live in a world where ideologies like Confucianism and liberal democracy prevail, and we would be okay. That was the view. Uh, but as happened, China began to grow more and more powerful. It began to look more and more like a peer competitor of the United States when you looked at its economic capabilities. And then it began to change, to translate those economic capabilities into military capabilities. And the end result is that the United States was started fearing China. That's what happened. It's exactly what I would expect. The Chinese argued that what they were doing was purely defensive in nature. The Chinese said, what's wrong with us building up our military somewhat now that we're getting economically more powerful when you, the United States, are much more powerful militarily than us? The United States didn't see it that way. The United States saw every step that China was taking to defend itself as an offensive move against the United States. As you know, Glenn, this is the classic security dilemma. Anything that one state does to defend itself looks offensive to the other side. And the end result here is that the Chinese began to build up their military capabilities as they got more powerful. And I also believe they began to think about dominating East Asia. And as I said before, it makes perfect sense from their point of view. If you're the Chinese, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want the United States military in your face? Do you want the United States military in East Asia? If I'm Chinese, if I'm Deng Xiaoping's or Xi Jinping's national security advisor, and they ask me, what do I think of the American military presence in East Asia? I say, I want the Americans out. I don't want the Americans in my backyard. Look, in the United States, we have the Monroe Doctrine. We do not want the Chinese in the Western Hemisphere. Well, if we don't want the Chinese in the Western Hemisphere, why should the Chinese want the Americans in East Asia? And the answer is they shouldn't. So, as China grows more powerful, you should expect the Chinese to want to push the Americans first out beyond the first island chain and then out beyond the second island chain. From their point of view, this makes eminently good sense. And of course, the Americans are not going to be happy about this any more than the Japanese, the Filipinos, or the Australians are going to be happy about this. So there's going to be huge pushback. And this, of course, is what you're getting today. So I think what's happened here, Glenn, in a very important way, is those ideologies that underpinned American thinking and Chinese thinking in the 1990s and in the first, decade and a half of the 21st century did not work out the way people anticipated. The world did not become peaceful. Confucianism and liberalism did not provide magic formulas for allowing China to rise peacefully. I think what happened here is that basic realist logic kicked in once you began to move away from unipolarity. Once China began to reach a point where it could be considered a great power. And once Putin brought the Russians back from the dead, and you had three great powers instead of one great power, realist logic was back on the table, as someone like me would expect. Now, am I happy about this? No. My book, where I lay out my realist theory, is entitled The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And I'd like to underline the word tragedy. I think this is tragic, this situation that we're in with regard to US-China relations. But I think this is just the way the world works when you're in an anarchic system, when you're in a system where there is no higher authority. This is what you should expect. And this is why I was arguing for a long, long time during the unipolar moment that you would eventually reach the point that we're now at. But it is a tragic situation. I regret that this is where we're at. Now, you asked the question, where is this all headed? My view is you want to separate security competition from war. And I think there's no question you now have, and you're going to have for the foreseeable future, an intense security competition between the United States and China. It has a military dimension for sure, and this includes the alliance structures that the United States has fashioned in East Asia, and it has an economic dimension that mainly revolves around cutting edge technologies. That competition is here to stay for the foreseeable future. There's no question about it. But the really important question is whether or not we're going to have a war between the two sides. And this is a subject that concerns me and virtually everybody else who looks at what's going on in East Asia today. I do not think war is inevitable. And you want to remember that during the Cold War, and here we're talking about the security competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the United States was working mightily to prevent the Soviets from dominating Europe and even East Asia, we did not have a war. It ended peacefully. We definitely had an intense security competition, and there was an ever present danger of war, as the Cuban Missile Crisis points out, and the various Berlin crises as well. But thankfully, we did not have an actual hot war. And my great hope is that moving forward, the security competition in East Asia, which is not going to go away, will not result in a hot war.